Hey guys, Fox here. And today we're going to be doing a video that I had been talking about doing for a while now, and finally have a reason to, and it is the top 10 players of the 2022 USFL season. These are my personal top 10, kind of top 10, you'll see, because naturally this is my list, I can do creative changes if I want to, which I did, you'll see. So, as I just said, there's a reason to it. For those of you who don't know, the USFL network has teamed up with, for some players and some coaches to actually do a USFL top 50 players, just like the NFL top 100. It's the top 50 players of the 2022 season. As they say, it's voted on by coaches, players, and the media of, USFL Network, which is one of the big sites for the USFL news. And so because of that, I decided to make my list now of my top 10 players, since I thought those guys would be, higher up in the top 20s, at least, of the top 50, which, no, already. And naturally, I'll have a video about the top 50 when it actually is, fully out and stuff like that. But as for now, let's just get started with the top 10 players of the 2022 USFL season. Coming in at number 10 is going to be Birmingham Stallion Marlon Williams. To put it simply, despite the fact that he didn't make the All-USFL team, I believe Williams was one of the best players to not make the All-USFL team, and overall his impact was big enough to deserve being on this top 10. He had over 400 yards receiving. In fact, he had 474 yards receiving total. That was good for third in the entire league. And his 4 receiving touchdowns was tied for second in the league as well. Not to mention, he only did this on 32 receptions, which wasn't a ton. So he was getting a very solid amount of yards per each reception. In terms of the playoffs, as playoffs do affect this rankings for me, by the way, just not by a ton, but by some. Even though in the semifinal he was basically just a short yardage catcher, the championship game is where he really let it out. He had a touchdown and 105 yards receiving. He led all players in the championship game for receiving, and arguably could have won MVP of that game. He didn't, but he was overall insanely great and definitely deserves to be on the list, and that's why he comes in at number 10. Coming in at number 9 is the guy that I said was the best quarterback of the 2022 USL season, in Case Cookus. To put it simply, yes, Cookus is the highest player, as I guess, spoiler warning, but I had him as my best quarterback in my top 10 quarterback list from the 2022 season, and I don't think that there were really any other quarterbacks, or he himself was good enough for even higher on this list, but with that being said, he was still fantastic across the year. To put it simply, in terms of his stats, just looking at the playoffs, they arguably would have won the title if he didn't get hurt. Granted, you can say the same with Jamar, but you get the idea. In the title game, he was excellent. He had a 117.3 rating as he had 3 touchdowns with 58.6 completion percentage, 222 yards throwing on 17 to 29 attempts, as well as having 4 yards on the ground on 1 rush. Then in the semifinal, even though passing he was actually pretty bad, he went 10 for 20 with 133 yards and a pick with no touchdowns with a 50.6 QBR. He did lead his team in rushing with 39 yards and a touchdown. So he did have 1-1 if you count his rushing and interceptions, passing, you know what I mean? Now, in terms of the overall stats, despite the fact that he didn't even play the first really 2.5 games, due to that being when Brian Scott was still playing before he got hurt, he still ended up being third in quarterback rushing yards across the league at 217. Granted, that was helped a lot by his 79-yard run he had one game. His 4 fumbles was kind of questionable, was just like in the top 10 QB list, was what made me debate kind of having him as high. But his 4th in passing yards, 4th in passer rating, and 5th in completion percentage all were enough for me to put him this high. To put it simply, the Stars did have a very decent receiving course, but I don't think it was as good as an overall offensive unit as some other teams that had other quarterbacks, like Jamar Smith, like DeAndre Johnson, Luis Perez. So because of that, I do have him as the best quarterback, and he is at number 9. Coming in at number 8 is, coincidentally, number 8 of the Stars in Channing Stribling. Channing Stribling may not be in the USFL as of right now, as he is now in the XFL, but it is unarguable that he definitely deserves to be on this list. Now, am I a bit low for him? Perhaps. But I'm going to do what I'm going to do. I do have him in 8. He was an all-USFL defender as a cornerback. Why? Well, to put it simply, he played in 7 games and he had 7 interceptions. So he's on pace for 10 in a full season, which is incredible. In the playoffs, he did play hurt during both games pretty much. He got some sort of injury, I'm pretty sure, in the semifinal that carried over the title game. So he only had 7 combined tackles in both games, but really, his playoff performance kind of hinders him a bit on the list. As I said, it does affect a little bit, but his regular season stats are nothing to sneeze at. 11 passes defended was a solid number, but his 7 picks really is what made him, great. He did have a sack as well and a couple TFLs, so he could get around and run around and stuff like that. And having only 16 tackles shows that he was really an overall great corner, like in coverage as well. Put it simply, he was a very, very, very solid cornerback. It's just, I don't think that overall he was good enough to get higher up on the list. I think that 8, aside from the fact that, yeah, it's funny that he was number 8. I realized that as I was putting him on the list. But I do feel like his interceptions are great. But aside from that, I don't think there's enough for me to put him higher, as some other guys are able to do great in multiple areas and not just one. Granted, he was for sure the best cornerback in the league, even with Will Likely being outstanding. So number 8 for the interception leader, Channing Stribling. Coming in at number 7 is our second Birmingham Stallion in DeMarcus Gates. I put him just above Channing Stribling because, as I said about doing multiple things, this guy did multiple things. He was a very solid rusher and a decent linebacker as just a, outside or like an inside linebacker type guy. He was an all USFL linebacker. In the semifinal game, he had an interception which he returned for a touchdown. He had a pass defense. He had a TFL and 5 solo tackles, which is just great. In the title game, he had 2 passes defended, half a sack, and 7 solo tackles with, 9 total. To put it simply, he was excellent in the playoffs. Borderline just incredible. Then in the regular season, he had 6.5 sacks, which is good for 3rd in the league. He's not even on the line. He's not even like, a DE or something. Yes, he basically can play both outside and inside linebacker. 12th in tackles while being 3rd in sacks is incredible to have. And not to mention, he did have a couple forced fumbles as well, and fumble recovery. And just note about the pass defenses, in the playoffs, in those 2 games, he had 3 total. He had 3 in the regular season, which is the knock in the regular season for him, but it shows just how great he was able to achieve in the playoffs. Note, he also didn't play all 10 games, so his, league-leading 11 tackles for losses could have been higher, his sacks could have been higher, and other things. Put it simply, the guy got an interception, 2 forced fumbles, led the league in TFLs, was 3rd in sacks and 12th in tackles, all USFL member, unarguably has to be in the top 10. I have him at 7. Now, coming in at number 6 is Jordan Ellis. I will be the first to admit, I probably did put him too high. I probably did. I could definitely see a lot of people put him less. Now, I will say this. Is he not even a top 30 player in the 2022 USFL season? No way. He has to be at least there. Okay, the fact that he was already on the list, because by this point we've gotten to, I think, 33 in the top 50 as they're releasing it by a day. He was way farther up on the list, and I couldn't believe it. To put it simply, Ellis was great. He may have touched the ball a good amount of times, yeah, sure. But the bottom line, as on a Breakers team with a quarterback that was insanely volatile, he and Sal Cannella were basically the steadier ships of that team. To put it simply, even though he had a solid amount of touches, he had 150 touches or attempts a game rushing. He fumbled once, and he didn't even lose it. He was great at holding onto the ball, and even though I don't have it on there, which is my bad, he does have the 3rd most scrimmage yards in the entire season. Remember, scrimmage yards is basically receiving and rushing, so, no returning, stuff like that. But he was literally 3rd in scrimmage yards. In the semifinal, he did pretty bad, I will say that. He only had 1.1 yards a carry, which is terrible, but he did have a touchdown, so that's pretty good. But the bottom line is he was tied for 4th in rushing touchdowns, as he had 4, and he was 1st in rushing yards. To put it simply, is he was 4 yards away from being the league leader in rushing yards. He did have 83 receiving yards. I think it's criminal how low he ended up being on the list. I think he was in the 40 to 45 area. I can't remember off the top of my head. But it was insane that he was even on the list yet to begin with. I may have put him a bit higher. I could definitely see an argument moving him down. I would argue all the way to 9. I do think he was better than Marlon Williams, though, for sure. But even though he didn't make the All-USFL team, I really do think he did deserve it. Same with another running back. But I will put him 6th. I'll stand by him being a top 10 player. 6, kind of questionable. But you're 3rd in scrimmage yards. You're 1st in rushing yards. And I know stats aren't everything. But the guy still averaged 4 yards an attempt, if you're averaging over 3.5, you're basically doing a good job. As the idea is, can you run 3 straight times and get a first down according to your average? He can. He deserves to be high on the list, at least in the top 10, at least top 20. It's insane that he wasn't. Coming in at number 5 is Houston Gambler Donald Payne. He was an all-USFL linebacker, and to put it simply, he had the most pick sixes of the entire league for whatever that's worth, but I put it down because he had 2 of them, which is pretty incredible. He also had the 4th most interceptions in the league as a whole as a linebacker, and he was first in tackles. Those are overall incredible numbers to have. You got to understand, that's just incredible overall that he was first in those, especially considering the fact in terms of tackles, he was literally the only guy to have over 100 tackles in the entire league. It's not even joking. He was the only player with 100 tackles. That shows just how great he was as an overall inside linebacker type player. I remember when I was talking about Frank Gidden and how everyone was underrating him because of his tackling ability and other stuff like that. Payne was literally like Frank Gidden, except even better at everything. He also had 2 sacks. He still had 6 TFLs. And he did have 7 passes defended. He was an overall monster and helped make that Gamblers defense just so scary. He's one of 3 Gamblers in the all-USFL defense. You know what? He was a great player. Really, really great player. Definitely top 10. I have him at top 5 at number 5. Coming in number 4 is where I said kind of top 10. I'm putting Thunder and Lightning together. Dick Dye saves lives, Darius Victor, and then Trey Williams, the man, the myth, the guy that I had first of my non-all-USL member players. I decided to put them together as it was just, it's hard to put one above the other. To put it simply, Victor was such a just overall threat when you got close to the red zone. There's no shock why he has so many touchdowns. He led the league by a mile with 9 rushing touchdowns, which is incredible. He was overall just fantastic. They both were really fantastic. But I decided to put them together at number 4 because I can. It's my list, so I'm going to do it. Do it simply in terms of just the playoffs, get it out of the way. They weren't that great in the playoffs, really. They were solid for a tandem for sure. Now, if you're viewing it one by one, yeah, you'd say not 100 yards, but have the fact that they both had solid stats was pretty good. Victor did have a lot more yards at 64, but he only averaged 4 yards a carry, but he did have a touchdown. Williams, on the other hand, had 40 yards, which was 24 less, but he averaged 0.4 more yards per carry and had 12 yards receiving. Put it simply, Williams and Victor were both overall great. I also forgot to list this as I forgot about yards from scrimmage when I was getting to these graphics, but literally Victor and Williams was the number 1 yards of scrimmage guy, and Victor was number 2. They were literally the top 2 players in overall scrimmage yards, rushing and receiving. So I think it's pretty good because you'd imagine for, a Thunder type of back that Victor wouldn't have receiving yards, but he did have over 100 and a receiving touchdown. Now, no, Williams is the only guy to have 700 yards from scrimmage. I know it's not there, but yeah, you can do the math really quick. He's the only guy in the whole league to have 700 yards from scrimmage. And to put it simply in terms of the overall successes, as for Williams, he was 2nd in rushing yards. He had the most rushing attempts without a fumble, as he had 118 rushing attempts and didn't fumble once. And he was tied for 7th in rush yards per attempt. Whereas Darius Victor, he was 3rd in rushing yards, 1st in rushing touchdowns, all-USFL team, and offensive player of the year. To put it simply, if you eliminate the all-USFL and OPOY, you realize that they were both insanely close. It's just that Victor had those touchdowns from being that better goal line threat. And I don't think that's enough to fully justify putting him a couple spots above and just a top 10 that, I'm just making. I decided to put them together. They were a combo. And, it was just like when I talked about the Luis Perez, DeAndre Johnson, the top 10 quarterbacks. It's so hard to just put one above the other that even though I did have one I'd rather have, it's still close. But in this one, I decided to just go back at it. These two should be together. They were both great. I hope that they're back-to-back in the top 50. I doubt they will be, but I do hope they are. But simply, they're both great running backs. And, hey, even if I did split this up and kicked Marlon Williams off the list for the top 10, they'd still be both in the top 5. The Generals, to be honest, the fact that they didn't win that playoff game is pretty sad. But, you know what? These two guys were fantastic. Coming in at number 3 is the third stallion on this list, Victor Bolden Jr. It's not a shock. To put it simply, I think the top 3, everyone knows who the top 3 is. It's just how do you order it. Why Victor Bolden? Championship game. He had 64 yards receiving. He had 92 yards on kick return, including a 43 long. And he had 2 punt attempts that didn't do anything. But he also won title game MVP. He was a champion. And not to mention, in terms of the semifinal, even though he only had 2 yards receiving and 1 reception, which was bad, he did return a kick to a touchdown for 90 yards, as well as still having 2 other kicks that he returned for another total of 76 yards. He had 166 yards returning in that one game, including a kick return touchdown. Fantastic stuff. In terms of the regular season, the guy was all USFL as not only wide receiver, but as a special teamer. He was 4th in receiving yards. He was 3rd in yards after catch. He was 3rd in receptions. 1st in all-purpose yards, which is that yards in scrimmage plus punt return, kick return yards. He was 3rd in punt return yards. 2nd in kickoff return yards. That's incredible. The amount of that list is just insane. I think looking back, because I'm pretty sure back when I did my biggest snubs or something like that, I think I did say that Bolden was a bit overrated on that. But especially looking back, not just in a pure receiver sense, but just overall, man, he really was better, and I have changed my mind about that overall. He was fantastic. He definitely is one of the best players USFL had to offer last year. I have him at 3, but honestly, pending your argument, I could see you putting him at 1. I'm not even joking. These top 3, I really do feel like are pending your vote. I think a lot of it depends how you view playoffs or not as well. So I have him at 3. Coming in at number 2, and this might shock a lot of people unless you watch all my videos, is KaVontae Turpin. KaVontae Turpin was fantastic. Why? He won USFL MVP. I don't care if this is a spring football league. The fact that a wide receiver won MVP is incredible. That has literally never happened in the history of the NFL. It happened the first year of the USFL. Now, yes, you could say that's because the quarterbacks that played the whole year were either hella mid or just not that good or didn't play all 10 games, stuff like that. Yada, yada, yada. You can say, while running backs had tandems or, weren't insane. KaVontae Turpin was him. The guy played on a team where if you go to anyone, you probably can't, any USFL fan, it's a casual US fan, they probably can't name any other receiver on the Generals. Maybe they can name, Satterfield from the first touchdown of, the whole league. But aside from that, you'll be hard-pressed to probably find someone who can name one. You name the quarterbacks, you name the running backs. But receivers, KaVontae Turpin. 1st in receiving yards. 1st in yards after catch. Tied for 2nd in receiving touchdowns. 2nd in receptions. 1st in punt return yards. Tied for 1st in return touchdowns. 4th in scrimmage yards. All USFL punt returner. All USFL wide receiver. USFL MVP. In the semifinal, he had 3 yards rushing. He had 20 yards receiving. And he had that punt return touchdown. And that punt return touchdown was literally the only reason the Generals nearly won that game. I said it before and I still stand by it. Mike Riley single-handedly sabotaged the Generals. Now, I'm not saying he sabotaged them on purpose, but I'm saying he blew the game for him. His quarterback decisions were really whack. And, Perez should have been benched or subbed out at some point. But KaVontae Turpin kept him in that game with that punt return touchdown. And overall in the season, he was fantastic. His 921 total yards AP-wise also put him 4th in all-purpose yards, as he was also 4th in scrimmage yards as a receiver, which, yes, that meant that the Generals had 3 of the top 4 scrimmage guys, which is not somewhat insane. It's, legitimately unbelievable. But he had over 500 receiving yards. He was the only player to do that. And the fact is that he was 2nd in receptions. He only had 44 receptions. 316 of his 540 yards were yards after catch. It shows that he was either completely burning his man or he's making fantastic moves down the field. He was a great player last year, but I don't have him number 1. Coming in at number 1 is Chris Odom. If you've watched a lot of my videos, this shouldn't shock you by how much I talk about how great he was. To put it simply, the Gamblers were in so many games Not because of just how great their defense was, but literally Odom himself. To put it simply, when you watch Gamblers games, it's the closest I've seen for a while, aside from, I guess, some games of Aaron Donald and J.J. Watt's primes, where it was like you were watching an old school Lawrence Taylor game where he's single-handedly keeping the team in the game. Odom had multiple games where he was getting insane just stat lines. The guy was in the running for player of the week on defense and special teams multiple times. He's a defensive end. He was on the special teams ballot multiple times because he had 4 blocked kicks in the season. In a 10-game season, he blocked 4 kicks. That is insane to do just in a career, let alone a season. I don't care what league that is for football. That's unbelievable. He was first in sacks by a mile, the only guy with 10. He was first in forced fumbles. He was first in block kicks. First in sack yards by a mile. I mean, even when you account for the fact that he had like 4 more sacks than the next guy, I'm pretty sure it was by like 50 yards or something insane. He was tied for 4th in tackles for losses. He was all USFL DE and Defensive Player of the Year. And I would say for sure, if the Gamblers had made the playoffs, he would have won MVP over Kevontae Turpin. He was insane. Even though he didn't recover any fumbles, one of those games is when, I can't remember who it was, but one of his teammates scooped up and scored the football a couple times. It's just, Odom was incredible. If you watched Gamblers games, he was the guy who you saw. Payne was fantastic. He deserves to be a top 10 on this list. He really does. But if you say that because he's on here, that Odom shouldn't be number 1, then I counter with Kevontae Turpin shouldn't be number 2 or even the top 3 because he has 2 running backs on this list. So, as a player for player though, I have Odom above Turpin because Odom literally would single-handedly keep his team in games up. When they lost, it was usually because the offense didn't do enough or the back of the defense didn't do enough. The big games where Odom would get like multiple sacks or get, a couple fumbles and the team would still lose because everyone else kind of just messed up. He still had 41 tackles as well as a defensive end. He was great. The bottom line is Odom is my number 1 player last year. I've basically said it the whole time, throughout like probably midway through the season till now, and I still stand by. He is the best player. Hopefully he recovers from his ACL tear that he had. Maybe he stays in the NFL and the Browns, keep him on for next year. If not, I really hope he comes back to the USFL, not the XFL, because I'd love to see him back with the Gamblers and, just keep that and try to have everyone keep that defense great. I mean, he was fantastic. He is my number 1 player of the 2022 USFL season. So that'll do it for this list. Now, as I said, I will be doing my review of the top 50 when it's all said and done. In terms of content coming up, I don't know for sure right now. Still waiting on a lot of things to, news come out, stuff like that. But if I want to know your guys' thoughts in the comments down below, and also what your top 10 would be in terms of players from last year, I would be interested to know what you guys think and what your reasonings are. As even though Odom didn't make the playoffs, I still feel that he was overall just such a dynamic force that he had to be number 1. So overall, this has been ZomFox. If you enjoy this content, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. And as always, have a great night.